Well, happy Thursday, folks. It is time for another episode of So What, the Marketing Analytics and Insights live show from Trust Insights. This week, Katie is being chased by bears, I think, again, in the woods.
Out in the woods, yet again. That's right. Hopefully, too bad she doesn't have that new iPhone with the satellite rescue function on it.
So hopefully all that is going well. So this week we're going to talk about network graphs. I know we've covered the topic a few times before, but it seems like it's timely since we're basically headed right into conference season. So John, when you're keeping an eye on events, what kinds of data are you looking at, and what do you do with it?
Yeah, the biggest thing for me is to be able to get the pulse of the event. On social is really where you can get it. Of course, I'm extra bitter today, ready to rant about the fact that I was all set to go to Inbound for today and tomorrow and tested positive for COVID. And it's classic for me too, in that like I got over the symptoms in 4 days. It was actually very mild. So I'm incredibly lucky on one hand, yet I'm still testing positive. And so I could not go to the show. So I'm watching all these virtual sessions, really pissed off that I have to do this. But in classic, virtual and back channel, yeah, I've been able to kind of keep up with what's going on and what are the hotter topics. They're talking about tracking the customer journey and basically HubSpot making kind of a full automation play, not just the marketing automation thing. But yeah, the biggest thing is to get access to the attendees, because the thing is, and I mean, you'll go into this deep, but if you make contact with all the major people that are publishing via social during the event, that is probably better than going to the event. You're kind of handcuffed when you're there in person. You can only do so much, whereas you can comb through the social data, the entire run of the show and even afterwards if you need to.
Gotcha. And then what do you do with that information? Like what's the action you take with knowing who the most talked about people are, for example?
For us, it's really categorization, kind of knowing what kinds of people are there. Because the big thing for us is there's probably 4 or 5 events where the people that go and are active at those events, they are just exactly the kind of people we want to be talking to, right? They're cutting edge. They want to go out and find out what's the newest and greatest. They're trying to understand what's going on. They're not afraid of upsetting the apple cart. They're willing to take some risks to go to an event and learn some things. So they're exactly the kind of people that we want to talk with and learn from. And they ultimately are our customers. So it's really the best prospecting that you can do. I mean, if we were a 100-person firm with millions of dollars, we'd just have a booth at these things, but that's not an option for us. And it's actually, the return is just far greater on engaging with the folks who are there. And we are still doing, the other thing is lining us up so that we can do sessions and be involved with, other versions of these events, know what's the people want to see and hear so that we can put that stuff together and create that content for them for the rest of the year.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's talk about what network graphs are, because it's a term that we've talked about a bunch of times. I've done some episodes in the past on it, but again, it's worth revisiting. In short, this is a network graph. So you can see this on the Trust Insights Twitter account. And a network graph is just a representation of, in this case, who's talking about who. And so interpreting this chart, the people who have the biggest bubbles on it are the ones who have been talked about the most. So, for example, in the tweet you see on the right-hand side, Trust Insights is the handle that we're broadcasting from on Twitter, and we've mentioned HubSpot and Inbound. So those would be 2 accounts that we're mentioning. So if you can imagine sort of a little scoreboard with little tick marks next to it, we would be essentially voting for the HubSpot account and the Inbound account with this tweet, which is saying we are sort of implicitly endorsing them by mentioning them. And the more that people do this, the more weight or authority they get in a network graph like this one. For example, we see in the upper left-hand corner there, Dharmesh Shah, the co-founder of HubSpot. A lot of people have mentioned him. A lot of people have talked about him at the show. We see Yamini Rangan, the CEO, sort of in the middle there. Again, a lot of people talking about her. And you see tons and tons of little dots of, even though they have lots of lines going to them, those are cases where you have somebody who is doing a lot of talking, but not a lot of people are talking back to that person. A lot of people are interacting back with that person. So this network map, this network graph, it effectively says, here's who is most talked about at this event. And to your point, It's a way of seeing who's got the attention of the crowd, because it's not necessarily just going to be the speakers. It's also going to be people who are there, who are networking effectively online. And to your point, some of these people, particularly people whose bubbles maybe aren't the largest ones, but are decently sized, might be folks we don't know yet.
Yeah, and we have to give a shout out to Christina Garnett, that Christina G at the bottom there. This is basically, she just has to send this paper in and she can get her performance review for the year. She's obviously overdue for a raise because she's crushing it. So there you have it. You're welcome.
Exactly. So that's what a network graph is. And again, the use case for it is identifying people who are most talked about. If you are doing any kind of influencer marketing or influencer identification, this should be one of your premier tools, because, and we'll talk about centrality measures in a little while, but just having access to this data dramatically simplifies who you want to approach first, right? Who are the people that, like, okay, this is someone I need to speak with because clearly they have the attention of the crowd. We have our friend George B. Thomas there on the left-hand side, somebody who has the attention of the audience. So if I was trying to figure out who is influential about the Inbound conference, clearly, obviously, Dharmesh being one of the co-founders and Yamini being being the CEO, they're clearly influential about this event, but the probability of you getting on either person's calendar, not terrific. Right?
Yeah, no, having to, it's the same deal. We see this for Dreamforce too. It's like Mark Benioff is always dominating the list, and you're not just going to walk into the tower and talk to Mark tomorrow.
No, exactly. But other folks like Christina Garnett or George Thomas and stuff, or Troy, they are folks that you probably would have a better chance of being able to talk to. And then if if you have something worth talking about, they might be helpful folks to help amplify your message. So, basic influencer marketing. So let's talk about how do you build something like this. I'm going to start off by saying, to build it effectively, you have to use some tooling. You have to use a bit of coding and stuff. You can do it by hand. It is extremely painful to do it by hand. It would take you days to even put together one of these things. By the time you did it, the event would be over for months. You start with a data feed of some kind. So in this case, we're using Twitter. You can also use Instagram. You can use TikTok. You can use anything where you can get essentially a data feed where there are identifiable sources of content and then targets of content. So in this example here, we see here's our screen name of the person doing the tweeting, Keith Spiro. And then over in this column, we have the text of what he tweeted. And he's tweeted at Inbound. So, in this case, this would be you would make a spreadsheet of pairs that shows Keith in one column and then Inbound in another. If we scroll down here, we have Christina G. So we have Akar Anil would be the source, and then Christina G, Yamini Rangan would be the targets of that. And essentially, you're going to create a large spreadsheet. Let's go ahead and pull one open here that shows here is how all of these different entities interact. So here's what the spreadsheet looks like. And you can see who did the talking and who they were talking about. And this goes on and on and on and on. This, just from a day and a half, you got 4,600 pairs of conversations. So that's step one. What's called in network graphing, it's called an edge list, the number of conversations.
Now, do you pull that stuff into Excel, or is this just a dump of what you're normally working with over in R?
This is just a dump. I would never attempt to do this in Excel. I would lose my mind. So that's part one, is taking all the tweets that you have and extracting out these source target pairs. The second part is, if you want more information about who these people are, you can also pull out their user information. So in this case, here are the names, the locations, and the descriptions of a lot of these accounts. This once you've done the influencer analysis, this actually comes in handy because you can get a bit more information about who the person is and sort of what their importance are. So again, going back to our friend Christina Garnett, we see, this is her Twitter bio, featured in HubSpot Academy, community and advocacy at HubSpot, MBA, and so on and so forth. We see Dharmesh Shah here with his co-founder and CTO at HubSpot, and so on and so forth. So these are what would be called nodes, or node information. And in that chart, an edge, let's go back to this. An edge is essentially what happens when, I misplaced it there. When you have a line between two connections, that's an edge. A node is the bubble itself. So in our spreadsheets, every one of those two column pairs represents one of these lines, and every essentially biography represents one of these bubbles. So that's the raw materials you need to make a network graph, and you have to process that. There's any number of ways. We use R. I use the R computing language. You can use Python. I'm trying to think if there's any utilities that do it that don't involve coding, and I can't think of any off the top of my head. So once we've got that data, we have to bring it into some kind of tool to do the visualization itself. The tool that I tend to prefer for casual network analysis is a tool called Gephi. Gephi, you can get it at gephi.org, Gephi.org. It is open source. It is free of financial cost. It doesn't have the world's best interface, and it has some show-stopping bugs that will bring it to a grinding halt. It is free, and it processes the data really well. With Gephi, the first thing you would do is you would import those two spreadsheets, your nodes and your edges, and it will create a nice little essentially internal spreadsheet of the data. So the data that you've brought in, all of the different handles and some of the basic metrics, if you provided that in there. So that's a starting place. Once you've got that, it will start to show you, help you visualize this information. So here's the raw, unedited look at inbound. And you can see there's not a lot that's very helpful here.
Yeah, no, this is still early stage.
Exactly. So there's some things that we want to know about this network, some things that would be helpful. And this is where we're going to start getting into all kinds of different measures. In any kind of network, there's this concept of degree. If you ever played 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, you know exactly what a degree is. It's how many jumps does it take to go from one node to another node. So in this case, we want to look at how well connected is every node in this network. The people who are more connected, who have more incoming connections or outgoing connections, will have higher degree numbers. The second thing we'll want to know is how do these things relate to each other with something called modularity. Modularity means essentially how closely related are things. If people talk to the same people over and over again, you're going to see connections within the network, and you can identify those with this thing called modularity and say, like, yeah, these people talk to each other, therefore we should probably pay attention to that. So let's go ahead and just add a bit of coloring. I use modularity because I like to apply colors to it. Now there's this sort of purplish color, which is one community. It's about 24% of the network. There's a green color, which is about another 24%. There's a blue color, which is about 4%. So we're starting to break up this huge cloud into individual pieces. The big question we have to ask, though, is how do we decide who is important? And there's a bunch of different measures for that. I'm going to go ahead and run a network diameter here and run one of our measures of centrality here. In network graphing, there are probably half a dozen different ways to measure someone's importance in a network. There are things like something called closeness centrality, which is how close or how connected is a node with the average length of the shortest path between that node and all the other nodes on the graph. That's good for seeing just who is, I guess, popular. There's a measure called betweenness, which is who is the shortest bridge between two nodes. Again, kind of a popularity thing. And then there's the one that we tend to look at the most, which is called Eigenvector Centrality. If you're familiar with Google's PageRank, it is based on this measure. And what it says is, instead of who you talk, how much you talk, measure how many people talk about you, and then how many people talk about them, and how many people talk about them, and so forth. And when you do that, you assign importance to who is talked about the most by people who are talked about the most, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So again, this is the big thing of having referenceable, content behind you, right? You can't swing that vote. Your stuff has to be actually promoted by other people to even score on that vector.
Exactly. And that's why I personally prefer that measure, because we all know plenty of LinkedIn thought leaders, if you will, who just love talking to the air. Right?
Yeah, well, it just like relentlessly published, just presuming that like spraying the world will get them there.
Exactly. And in simpler measures of influence, that would count, right? You can sort of throw the game. You can hack the algorithm by just vomiting content all the time. When you use something like an eigenvector centrality measure, if you're doing all the talking but nobody's talking about you, it pretty clearly indicates you haven't actually achieved anything. So let's go ahead and apply that. And we're going to apply our eigenvector centrality, and we'll make the maximum size here 99. And now we're starting to see this network shape up. Starting to see the different groups. For clarity's sake, we should probably apply some labels so that we're not just squinting at strangely shaped bubbles. And let's turn down some of those so that it's a little easier to see. And now we're now starting to see essentially that network graph. We see some of these different colors. So we have Dharmesh and Inbound there. We have HubSpot. We have Yamini. We have Christina. We have this Blackett Inbound community. We have Spitfire and Inbound, Christina K. So we're now starting to see these communities a little more clearly.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how that stuff breaks out, Now, as far as the color coding here, though, is that the green is the highest level then? Is that the deal? And then it's purple after that?
Purple has the biggest community, followed by green.
Okay.
It's interesting because what you're starting to see is like the HubSpotters themselves be sort of separated out in the green, and then the purple being just the event overall. And that tends to happen at any event which has a strong social presence. Now, this is still a little confusing to look at. So the next thing we want to do is try to organize the data into some kind of layout. And there are gazillions of different choices. For an event like this, the one I use is an algorithm called the multi-gravity force atlas. The names aren't terribly important, but what is important is what they do. And this is going to essentially take this giant hairball and start to try and organize it and put similar nodes together. And we can see here it's already pulled some of the HubSpot stuff out. Let's do a quick sort. There we go. And now you can definitely see just in the coloration, there's sort of this greenish area here. There's a purple area, and there's sort of a blue area. It is moving those different communities into their own clusters so that it's easier to see, so it's easier to explore. Let's go ahead and just hit pause. And now if we zoom in, we can definitely see, here are some of the headline speakers, the keynote speakers, right? You have
right, Jane Goodall.
The Jane Goodall Institute, Viola Davis, former President Obama, etc. In the green area, definitely some of the HubSpotters for sure. And then we have some NFT folks down here doing their thing. But this is now more interpretable of a graph.
Yeah, it's that constant struggle of trying to show as much of the links as you possibly can, but still keep the thing readable.
Exactly. And so you can choose, there's a gazillion different algorithms you can use. I find that these sort of these force atlas ones that essentially try to almost replicate almost a gravity, do a pretty good job of taking a network and moving it around. And you could actually let this run for a while, and it'll keep trying to find optimal sorts. It's very relaxing to look at if you need a few minutes. But at this point, our network graph is pretty well sorted. And now at this point, what we could do is say, okay, I want to now turn this maybe into something a bit more publication ready. So let's go ahead and close that. And let's do our show labels. Let's put our font to 8 point and rescale our weights and show. Okay, that looks good. And let's hit refresh. And now we've got a nice chart here. This is what shows up in screenshots. This is what we put up on Twitter and things like that. It's a fun sort of Where's Waldo representation. And if you're being talked about at inbound, there's a good chance that you're on here somewhere.
Now, how about taking this, where else would you go with this data? Because I know this is great that we can hook people in with an example and show who's effective and what's going on there. But what other kind of stuff would you pull out of here?
Well, see, the visualization is fun, but it's not where the good stuff is. The good stuff is in the spreadsheet. So I'm going to go ahead and export this table here. And let's go ahead and open up that table in Excel. If you have an agency or a social media marketing team, let's go ahead and sort and filter. This now is your checklist of the people that you should be engaging with, right? So you now have this nice list of who these people are. And if there are accounts, specifically accounts or topics that you think would be valuable for your company to be involved in conversations, this is what you do with it. You take this and say your social team, go engage with these people, go follow them, go retweet some of their stuff, direct message them if it's appropriate, see if they have sponsorships available, maybe if they're a creator, a professional creator that you could sponsor. This is the useful output of network graphing, is this spreadsheet that says, let's go talk to these people. So if I was at the event and I needed you to do some sales follow-up, I would say, here's the list. See what you can get out of these people.
Yeah, I can see that. That's where you want to start, as far as who's worth talking to. That kind of filters through all the junk. Exactly.
Because there will be, and you can see when you scroll, really, really, really far down on the list, there's folks out there who are, just participating in the conversation, just listening, or maybe tweet once or twice. But they're not necessarily folks that are on everyone else's minds. When you're one of these, sort of top 50 people, by definition, other people are looking to you for your take on things. And so if I had a product or service I wanted to sell, I might reach out to someone like Ashley Faust from Atlassian and say, hey, here's our new paper on private social media communities. Would you give it a read and let me know what you think? Would you mind sharing it with your audience if it's appropriate? And because we know these folks are thought leaders, we know these folks are of interest to the crowd. If they recommend it, then it will probably do better than just handing out randomly to somebody.
And of course, we don't want people just to bulk load this and start spamming the heck out of these people. That's not the way you want to do this. It's a bad idea.
No, that is generally a bad idea. Although you can take the list. I believe Twitter at least still allows you to upload lists of handles. So you certainly could reach out to people who you've identified as being involved in the inbound conversation. If you wanted to promote something via Twitter advertising, you could certainly do it that way. We've done that in the past, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, shared something saying like, the missing inbound session, the one that wasn't at the conference, you can check out here. But that's something that you might want to do quickly in a very timely manner, particularly if you can do it maybe on day one of the event. And by the time day 3 rolls around, people have gotten a chance to take a look at it.
Yeah, and then how about working at it from a different angle? So obviously this proves the way to get some content that's relevant, how to create relevant content. So if you were going to an event, what would you keep in mind as far as what you're tweeting about or who you're tweeting with at the show that would actually make it, ultimately show up in the chart?
If you want to be seen at the event, you need to create stuff that other people are going to mention. It's one of those sort of classic things. When we do these sorts of explorations, they do tend to do very well because people like talking about themselves. This is probably I believe this is our best performing tweet so far this quarter. People like that stuff. People like hearing about themselves at an event. If you've identified early on, maybe before the event, certain speakers are being talked about more often than not. Those would be the sessions to go to, and then you live tweet or you live share from those sessions, because if that's already on the audience's mind, you're going to be able to provide them that information, especially if the speaker hasn't planned any of their own pre-scheduled social and they're relying on the crowd to share it. I mean, that would be, to me, an easy win for being at an event.
Okay, so yeah, you can grab those, the upcoming keynotes, the big ones, and make sure that you're doing live tweeting on site for that.
Yep. On a more tactical level, following the event hashtag, downloading, the last hour's worth of tweets, the last 2 hours worth of tweets, whatever, and just looking at the engagement scores and just retweeting stuff that's doing well. That's low hanging fruit. That's a pretty easy thing. It may not add a ton of value, but if there are insights from the event that are trending, it never hurts to reshare them to your audience.
Right. And that's just an even quick, easy hit too, because as an event is going on, I always keep a running list of the accounts that are there and are doing things. And so by having this, you can automatically make sure that you've got those in your list. And so now you're watching real time as the stuff goes through, because that's great. I'm able to, keep a pulse on what's going on at the show as far as what's hot and what's happening. Yeah, it's even faster than if you were on the floor, because you'd be limited to one session on the floor. But by watching a feed like this, you can keep track of multiple sessions at the same time. Like even Tamsin Webster had tore it up at 11 a.m. and her session was virtual. She actually wasn't even in the building, but she's been getting a lot of chatter, overall from the show. So that's a great way to kind of just be able to keep your finger on the pulse.
Yep. The other thing you can do with this data is if there are accounts and personalities that you probably are not going to get a shot at reaching out to directly, once you've identified them using this kind of data, you can then, again, using the API, extract who are all the accounts they follow and do an intersections set. Basically, are there accounts in common that Dharmesh and Yamini and Brian and George and Ashley all follow? If there are, those might be additional sources of opportunities for you to pitch, right? If there are certain publications, maybe they all read Scott Brinker's Chief Martech. Well, okay, if they are all following that account or they're all engaging with that account, then that's a pretty obvious place where you should be trying to land some content, because that the eyes of the people who are most influential to the crowd are on those places. That's where they're getting their information from.
All right, that's solid. How about, what have you seen? Well, I was going to say, what have you seen over, because you've run these multi-day? Is there anything that multi-day running teaches you or gives you reason to make it important that you do run it over multi-day?
Running it multi-day is important, particularly when you look at early influencers, to see if they manage to sort of hold on to their engagement. This is especially important for speakers. Like if you speak on one day earlier on, to see how much pull through you have, how much influence you have for the rest of the event. If people keep talking about you, or if the next day you just vanish from the charts, that gives you a sense of how impactful what you had to say was. For people who are behaving as influencers, it's a simple measure of saying, okay, how engaged are you? So for somebody like Christina Garnett, who is trying to build ambassadors for the HubSpot brand, this kind of data would be extremely useful to see who continues to have pull day after day, who continues to have a voice that other people are talking about over time, especially if you run this, say, a week after the event, and you see, are there still conversations? There's still people talking about the event well after it's over. If they've maintained mind share, then those are people that you want to put on the short list of your influencers.
All right, so yeah, the folks that actually have the ability to hang on to it for more than one day, that's huge.
Exactly. Whereas, you may have somebody who speaks one day and then poof, they're gone, and nobody references that session the following days. Like, okay, maybe something happened, maybe something that it didn't land as hard as it should, as you would have liked it to. So that's network graphing. We covered what they are, how to use them, and the basics of constructing them. Again, in terms of the tools needed, you do need to access the data from probably from some kind of API, or from a really good social listening tool, something like Talkwalker, for example. You need to then export that data, turn it into those lists of the nodes and the edges, and then use a piece of free software like Gephi to visualize it and to turn it into a network graph. The thing about network graphs is that it doesn't have to just be social media data. It can be any data where you can identify connections from one point to another. So, for example, Microsoft has what's called the academic graph. They have built some machine learning that scans academic papers to see who is the most cited authors. Right. So if you wrote a paper on RNA sequencing, and everybody and their cousin for the next 20 years has been referencing that paper, you're going to show up in the academic graph as being, one of the thought leaders on RNA sequencing. So this is agnostic to how you do the connections. It can be any sets of connections that you can put together. You could do it with your own social media followers. You could do it with Slack groups. If you administer a Slack group, and you can see who's talking to whom, you can measure those conversations. Any set of interactions between groups of people is something that you can use network graphing for. So it really is, the sky's the limit on what you can do with it.
That sounds good. Yeah, of course, if you want to run these or have any questions about how it could be run, if you don't want to spend, the next 3 weeks digging around in R and trying to figure out how to use Gephi, you could just give us a call. That'd be a much faster and easier way to get that done. After Inbound is over, we'll share the export spreadsheet in the Analytics for Marketers group. If you want to just play with the data itself and see, sort of the catalog of what Inbound had to say. Actually, that would be kind of fun for one of our monthly makeovers, is hand that out and see what folks can do with the data, see if there's any interesting visualizations or any interesting insights. But we'll put that in the Analytics for Marketers group. So I don't see any comments in the queue, so we're going to go ahead and roll on out of here, and we will talk to you folks next week. Thanks for watching today. Be sure to subscribe to our show wherever you're watching it. For more resources and to learn more, check out the Trust Insights podcast at trustinsights.ai/TI podcast, and our weekly email newsletter at trustinsights.ai/newsletter. Got questions about what you saw in today's episode? Join our free Analytics for Marketers Slack group at trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers. See you next time.